Hello, and welcome to Motown by the Book, a series dedicated to exploring books about Motown. My name is Sheila Spencer, General Manager of Motown Museum. Today, I'm interviewing music industry writer and Motown chronicler Adam White, whose wonderful 2016 book, Motown, The Sound of Young America, presents the official visual history of Motown Records. The work, also inspired by Barney Owls, has been critically acclaimed, published in 7 languages, and is a must read for any Motown fan. Adam, thanks so much for joining us today.
So how are
Hi
you
there.
doing?
All right. I just had a cup of tea, so I'm just fine.
Oh, you're good.
I
Thank-
like to conform to the English stereotype.
I think I'm conforming too, because that's my go-to every morning. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So Adam, how did you get the inspiration to write your book, Motown, The Sound of Young America?
Well, I guess the inspiration came about 15 years ago. I think at that point I realized, having been a lifelong fan of the music and the artists and everything, I think I realized at that point, despite all the books, despite all the biographies and autobiographies and other books, there was still, Motown has such a rich history. There was still more to know.
Right.
And particularly, I think, about some of the people I call the backroom believers who helped build the company. And I think it sort of came into focus when I was doing an interview with Barney Ales, who I'd already known for some years, but there was Universal Music put out a series of Motown CDs called the Complete Motown Singles, wonderful series of all the 45s the company released. And I did an interview with Barney for one of those, and it reminded me, how close he was to the center of action, how important he was to building the company, helping Mr. Gordy do all of those things, particularly on the business side,
Absolutely.
and someone whose memory was pretty great and who knew all this stuff. So I had in my mind, there was someone who could help shape it and introduce some new material, stuff that hadn't been talked about before.
Right.
And I think, as I said, because there was always so much more to know, that was important, finding someone who hadn't really told as much of the inside story as others had done. So that was the inspiration and then the realization that it needed to be done.
Absolutely. Because this book is such a compilation of all of that. So it's an amazing mixture and compilation of all these different artists as well.
We
So
certainly
speaking
tried.
of Barney Owls, can you give us a sense of your experience working with the now late Motown executive Barney Owls to complete the book?
Oh, of course. I mean, it was everything I'd hoped when we finally decided to do it. And that really was about 2012. I thought, okay, I got a phone call from Barney's son, Brett, who said, listen, I know you guys have talked about this before, but if you're going to do it, maybe not, sooner rather than later. And I just thought at that point, since I was also considering, what I was going to do next, I was leaving Universal Music and thought, well, right, I've got to get on with it. And so I went over to spend some time with him in Los Angeles. And at that point, I realized, it was going to take a lot of work. Absolutely fine. It was exciting to do that. So we spent several days interviews, doing all the prep, if you like, at that stage. And then I came back to London. And then I did what, for the next couple of years, what I visited Detroit every Saturday for 2 years. Barney and I spoke on Skype for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours every Saturday. And I got to ask him every question I'd ever wanted to ask anyone about Motown, about the background, about the stories. So, that was pretty remarkable. And in addition, of course, Barney was able to connect me with some of the other people at the company. Some I knew and some I didn't. But you know, people like Mickey Stevenson and Eddie Holland and so on. Um, and so that combination of being able to ask him every question I'd wanted, to be able to really dig deep into the way the company grew, and then the people he put me in touch with, both in Los Angeles and in Detroit, that was, you know, that was just an extraordinary experience, even if not one word had come out of it.
Right. Absolutely. And you have such it's such a thorough account of so many, classic Motown artists. Can you walk us through a little bit more, even of that research process? Because as I look in your book, you have listed quite a few people that you've touched base with.
Yes, I mean the beauty of the whole project in a way was that because I'd been, as I mentioned, a lifelong, you know, a lifelong pilgrim for Motown. And during my years at Billboard, both in London and in New York, I had interviewed a fair number of the artists. So, you know, people like Smokey, Diana, Stevie. Um, and I'd kept all that material. And indeed, I'd kept everything, you know, I'd ever found about Motown in newspaper articles and so on. I was a real hoarder. So when it came to do that, it meant I had a lot of the material on tap, but I knew specifically what I wanted to ask. And rather than necessarily go through familiar stories because they've been told so often, I really did want to try and get to some of the untold and the fresher perspectives. And I think the two artists who stood out in that respect, one was Chris Clark, and remarkably, she remembered virtually every word of something that Mr. Gordy said at the beginning of Motown's first national sales conference in Detroit. So that was one thing that I wanted to kind of capture some of the elements of the day. And I think the other one would have been Mary Wilson, rest her soul, because um, aside from being, you know, in Motown's most celebrated, successful act, she had a sense, a really acute sense of the sort of political and social and racial context in which Motown operated, as the Supremes, you know, went through that extraordinary that extraordinary development, that progress. She was right there in the front of it, and so she was able to give me insights that I think would have been difficult or were unique to her and to the Supremes. I mean, a couple that come to mind. She said the first time they went to England,
Yeah.
the Supremes were treated like royalty. You know, people adored them. And she
And what's so amazing is that people from all over the world gravitate and can connect with Motown artists and the Motown music. It touches people everywhere.
yes,
So this book really represents that. And just a really thorough account of how so many of those artists and people that were touched in that space.
yeah, that was certainly the hope. I mean, you know, as a kid, teenager growing up in England, you know, Motown meant everything to me, and so I knew there were others like me, and I knew that, you know, all around the world there were kids hearing that music and being affected in the same way. So I hope that that extra perspective from outside America brought something to the book that otherwise, you know, wasn't in the history.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it definitely does. It definitely does. So tell me, Adam, what was your most memorable experience writing about a Motown artist? And this can be anybody, any one of our wonderful artists.
I think, I mean, you know, it's just I would have said it has to be those moments talking firsthand about the difficulties and the you know, and the challenges that they faced, and that story of Mary, those stories she told me were the kind of things that I think had the most impact. I I mean, I had in years past talked to a number of other artists, and as you know, artists, because they're always in the limelight, they tend to tell the same stories. They have to keep retain their sanity. If you're asked the same questions by the same journalists over and over,
Yeah.
I think that the challenge is saying something fresh, and reasonably enough, they go back to the stories they know, the stories that are popular, the stories that they want to tell, but they have been told very often,
And I'm
and
sure
so they're
many
not
of
as fresh. Yeah, I mean, when you come to a point, and I was very conscious of the fact that here I was writing a book in the 21st century, 50 years after it all began, and I wanted to try and bring a fresh perspective to it, add to the sum of knowledge, rather than repeat what had been said already. So I think in terms of the most memorable ones, it would have to be those kind of insights I got from Mary, from Chris, and then from people like Eddie Holland and
yes,
Mickey Stevenson, who worked closely with Barney, and who understood the difficulty of, in the early days of breaking those records and getting paid and all of the things that really mattered.
absolutely, absolutely. Because I'm sure so many of them had so many of the same experiences and stories, but had a different way of talking about those and
Yes.
just executing. Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you so much for that. So in your book, you write about Stevie Wonder and his bond with Motown. Can you elaborate more on that subject?
Yes, it was a good question. It really made me think about it, because again, Stevie is someone where it's almost hard to think of anything we don't already know. His life, since the age of 11 years old, has been in the public eye. Um, and so I thought about what it, for the book, and then for this question, really what it was that kept him so close to Motown. And I think it has to be that essentially, he grew up in Hitsville. I mean, this young, extraordinarily talented young man grew up among the people of Motown, the musicians, the fellow artists, but just the day-to-day stuff of that company. And I think that would inevitably, and it did, forge an extraordinary bond between him and the people there, and therefore the company. Um, and things like, he was the first Motown artist, as far as I'm aware, to ever travel outside North America. I mean, Marv Johnson, when he was managed and produced by Mr. Gordy, was signed to United Artists Records. So he was technically not a Motown artist. Stevie went to France in 1963. He's at the age of 13 years old, traveling the world, playing 2 weeks at a concert hall in Paris. I think those kind of experiences, surrounded by the people who supported him. Esther Edwards went with him on that trip to Paris. Um, those things bond you to people in a way that's more than just, you sign to the record company, you show up when you have to make a record or you have to do promotion. You're living the life. You're right there. And then you hear these lovely stories about, how Stevie would know which chocolate bar, which candy bar to buy in the candy bar machine that's, in the building in 2648.
Yeah.
And the bond, obviously, he created, he got with the musicians, Benny Benjamin, Papa Zita, James Jameson.
Yes.
Again, you're growing up with these extraordinary people around you, the talent around you. So, and this is nothing about his disability, about the blindness. I mean, kind of begin to imagine what that played, how that played into it.
Absolutely. That's really about his talent.
Yep. And his sense of humor. I mean, everyone has said to me, and I remember an experience too. He was funny. He would make jokes. Barney told me the time whenever he went to a radio station to meet a disc jockey, he would say to Barney, what color of tie is the DJ wearing? So that when he was introduced to the disc jockey, he could say, Mr. Seymour, I love the tie. That's a great blue tie you've got on. That kind of thing would look like, whoa, what? but it was those sort of personal touches, those very, you know, almost intimate things, I think, that made his relationship with the company something unlike that of anyone else who was there.
So tell me also, what intrigued you the most in writing your section about Berry Gordy?
The easy questions, right?
Of course.
Well, I was fortunate that I had interviewed him some years before, and obviously I'd read his autobiography. So I knew what he had talked about in the past, and I knew the anecdotes and the philosophies that he shared in his book, In To Be Loved. So I think it was important for me to try and you know, find some things that he hadn't talked about. And obviously, you know, the relationship with Barney helped in that respect. Kind of, you know, personal insights, if you like, I think were the things that for me, and I hope for readers, gave a little more sense of the character and the individuals, um, in addition to the story we all know about how he built the company and all of that. Fresh insights. There's so much to know about Motown that we still don't know.
Yeah.
That any chance to do it was what I wanted to achieve.
Lots of history, lots of history. So I tell you, I was happy to be here when you visited Motown Museum when your book first came out. Can you remark a bit about your experience just being in our space?
Oh, good Lord. Well, to a pilgrim, of course, it's Mecca. You know, I had visited Hitsville before that day, but if you had told me as a youngster when I first heard Heatwave or Baby Love or any of those extraordinary records that one day I was going to be standing in that space with a book that I had written with someone who had been there almost at the beginning, I just wouldn't have believed it. So the combination of that sense of improbability and then the recognition, the realization that you're standing in the building that has, you know, produced all of that music, that all of those people came from there, that it was a Mecca to me and to many hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, around the world. So it was quite a moment. Um, but then, of course, the trouble with being a pilgrim, although or what you might call a nerd, is that you know all sorts of useless stuff. Motown nerds will look at everything in that building, everything in that space, the photos behind you, the things on the wall, the business cards, everything, for the most minute detail, to see whether it, you know, it squares with what they know or what they think they know. Um, but to be able to do that in the place is just extraordinary.
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
and,
It,
and and you know, I think people, you know, it's very lucky. I mean, I attribute that largely to what Mrs. Edwards did, everything that she
absolutely.
kept, and her determination to keep it and then to turn it into something that people could see, is was wonderful and has made that place, you know, unlike almost anything else in music in the world.
Absolutely. And like I said, people from all over the world come just to be educated and enjoy the space that actually where all of that great music was made and where it all came. And Esther Gordy Edwards brought all of those pieces back together so that everyone around the world can enjoy that. So I
And the
totally
important
agree.
the important thing that also helps people who, until you go there, you you can't really get a sense of the perspective. You can't realize how small that studio was, you know, how narrow the corridors were, the apartment at the top of the building where Mr. Gordy stayed, you lived with the kids, with three kids. I mean, until you see that space, that seeing the actual physical space brings a dimension to it that you cannot otherwise get.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree. So tell me, as a writer, especially writing a book of this magnitude, what words of inspiration would you give to aspiring writers?
You can never do enough research. You can never stop digging to find out what you need to know in order to tell the story, any story, as completely and as thoroughly as possible. And fortunately, young people today have access to information through the internet to a greater degree than was ever possible. Even, when I was starting the book, um, I think about the information that's now online that 10 years ago I couldn't get, that I came to the Detroit Public Library to go through old newspapers because there was no way to have that information. So when you realize the resources that are out there, I think it is beholden on you to make the most of it, to dig as deep as you can, and you will never stop learning. There's a point at which you have to stop research and you have to write, but you also have to know that there'll always be more for you to discover, and that it's important to start with that outlook and dig as deep as you can.
Great words, great words. So in closing, I hate to close out already, but in closing, what words do you have for all the Motown fans who are watching today?
Keep the faith. Keep the faith. I had heard my first Motown record, in 1963, for goodness sake, in the previous century. And the music still moves me as much as it did then. So I think I would say that keep the faith with the music and with the artists, but also, and this is something else that is more possible today than it was when I was first growing up with the music. You can tell the artists, you can support the ones who are still with us in that respect. That you can go on social media. I mean, Chris Clark's on social media. Carolyn Crawford is there. Just a few days before she passed, Mary Wilson was there on YouTube, with her own YouTube channel. So I would say to people, at whatever point they come to discover and love Motown, share that love with the people who made it. Let them know what it means to you and why it matters to you, and to help make them feel that they truly achieved something, which they did.
Absolutely, because that goes a long way, a
Yes.
very long way.
Yes.
Well, Adam, thank you so much. I just want to just show the book.
Thank you.
And this is available at Motown Museum online, as well as our museum store. So come visit us. And we just want to thank you again for being here. And we've enjoyed the journey.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Keep the faith, right?
Keep the faith. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll
Thank you.
talk to you real soon. Thank
Talk
you.
to you soon. Bye.
Bye.